I'm extremely pleased to be here. The idea here will be to give you a very broad kind of introduction to the subject with a specific focus on competition and competition authorities. To give you in a nutshell who I am, I'm the chief economist of the Belgian Competition Authority. I hold a PhD from a University of Brussels, and I have been with the authority for now almost 10 years. So I'm very happy to be here. I have known Patrick back in the days of the University of Brussels, but I'll come back to that. So why is this subject important? For at least 2 reasons. I think, first of all, there is more and more attention to platforms and to the economics of the digital economy on one hand, and on the other hand, we know that data is important for these platforms and for the ecosystems, and I will come back to that. But I think that the precise question that we will discuss today about the relation between data and competition has not been very much explored. And so there is a literature on information and competition, but as you will get from the other speakers, not from me, because I will give a quite general introduction, but these relations are complex. And so I think it's important, to have people who do the basic research on these subjects before we, competition authorities, and the broader world takes them into account. Now, here are a couple of things I wanted to cite, but I won't have time to get through all these things. I guess that my slides will be available in the future. First of all, this idea that platforms and the digital economy gets more and more attention from competition authorities seems quite clear for at least from 2 angles. I gave you first, the increasing number of decisions, and there, you have Se Loger, Logikimo, for instance, in France, but you have a number of others, and I have only taken a couple, the most important ones. But Google has had 2 important decision lately, Facebook to Microsoft, Apple, and basically, these platforms attract more and more attention when they merge. Second, there are these abuses with basically, as you have seen, and Patrick referred to it earlier, calls to unbundle some of these platforms, but you have abuses with lately Google Shopping and Google Android at the EU level, but you have another important decision in Germany concerning Facebook and the role of data, and then you have some in a decision in France, which is quite old, but concerning Google as well. Second, next to these decisions, you have a number of reports. The Furman report for the UK government, the Jacques Kremer from the University of Toulouse, Yves-Alexandre de Montjoie, and Heike Schweitzer for DG Comp. I'll come back to their main results within a couple of seconds. There is a report by Fiona Scott Morton in the US, and a report, for those of you who have not read it, which I found quite interesting, by LearLab for the CMA. It was published, I guess, last week, and they have an unusual approach because they look back at mergers, and the question basically is, did we know things at the time that we should have interpreted differently, knowing how things have developed? And so basically, they look back, for instance, at Facebook, Instagram, and that's, I guess, a useful process to look back at decisions. Anyway, now let me dig 2 minutes in this Kremer et al. Report, which I would very much advise that you read as well if you're interested by the subject. What they say basically is that platforms have two distinctive forms from other economic sectors. First of all, there are very high returns to scale. So not only returns to scale that we have known in the past, but these returns to scale are extremely high. And second, there are a lot of network externalities. And these network externalities are both direct network externalities that we have known for a while, but also these indirect network externalities, so the two-sidedness that somehow means that on many of these platforms, actually, you want to contact another group. If you want to contact another group, this means that the consequence, as you see, is that it's difficult for users to migrate and that there is often a competition for the market and not only a competition within the market. Again, I'm sorry I go quite quick because the focus today is on data. But if you're interested by platforms and by how competition authorities think about platforms, this is definitely a very good resource. Now, speaking about data, they say two things about data. First of all, that obviously, and I'll come back to that, data is extremely important. And again, for the subject of today, it is I think crucial that you remember that competition authorities really think that data and the link to data is very important in platforms. Second, they somehow define data and they define it in two ways. They say, well, data can be obtained in different manners. Sometimes you volunteer, sometimes you observe. And that's something that platforms can do quite well. So basically, your iPhone, if you have a device by Apple, knows what you do. My device is run by Google, and Google knows much more about my life than I do myself because Google somehow can store this data. And so basically, some data is observed and some data is inferred. That is the idea that you use data to know more about people. Second, it can be used, and so, anonymity is important, whether data is individual, whether it's aggregated, or whether it's just broad contextual data. But so basically, what I want to do here is, to highlight that when we talk about data, it's important somehow to have an idea of which data and which type of usage of data we have in mind. Now, you might remember, this first page of The Economist where, they say that data is the most valuable resource. But so basically, what Kremer et al. Do next is that they start with, they explain how competition goes in these sectors. And they say, well, competition about platforms, among platforms, you have a first question, which is how they compete on prices. And one of the distinctive nature of their competition is that, first of all, you have a dynamic aspect, which means that if you compete for a market, it is very important to be the first one. And so you might want, in a dynamic context, to price low to start with, and then eventually raise prices. And so basically, what you witness in the beginning of the acquisition of clients or customer or users might not be what you will observe in the steady state. Second, you have the two-sidedness. When you have different groups of individuals, some might be charged more. And so basically, this means that, in some cases, you might observe very low prices, but this still does not mean that there is no abuse of dominance. Second, obviously, innovation is very important. Another aspect, and I think it's very important, and that was one of the first time that I saw this written as well, they focus very much on ecosystems. And when we will discuss data later, I think that it's good, having seen the slides of the two next speakers, I think that it's good that you remember this idea of ecosystem, because basically thinking of data and ecosystems is quite important, because it means that on some ecosystems, if you have data, you will be able to go one step further. And so therefore, the type of innovation that you have requires, in some cases, access to some type of data and access to the ecosystem. And so you have one of the conclusions they draw is that access to data is important, and that if you are not in the ecosystem, you might not compete as well as competitors that have an access to the ecosystem. Again, maybe less important, but the type of innovation that they have in mind, and I think that's again they describe it well. It's not an innovation like the innovations that we have used, back in the days where I was a student as an economist. It's not the type of innovation, the same type of innovation. Why? Because it's not discrete innovation. It's less structured. It's not always based on IPR. And basically, back in the days when I did a PhD on the economic of science, the type of innovation that we had in mind was maybe not the same type of innovation than the innovation that you have in these ecosystems. Anyway, this for how you can see data and platforms. And I will just now draw your attention to something that is a little bit closer to what we did at the Belgian Competition Authority, but might be interesting for you, in the context of this school and, telecoms. So we had quite recently, actually, the merger between Telenet. So Telenet is Liberty Global. It is the incumbent cable operator in Belgium, or a part of it, and they have bought De Vijver Media, DVM, and they operate 3 TV channels. And the reason why I focus on this merger is that basically it is the first of a number of mergers that are coming in the EU between a cable operator that somehow takes over a producer of content and a diffuser of content like TV broadcasters. And that raises a number of questions. So it was first notified to the Commission, but the Commission referred it back to Belgium. But I will, skim through the slides. I see that I take much more time than what I had promised. Sorry about that. The questions we had in mind was input foreclosure. So this idea that, the Telenet could foreclose TV distributors that compete with Telenet, so not taking the other channels. You had customer foreclosure as well. Basically, this idea that they would foreclose competing channels. But anyways, that's not the main message I want to convey. So the point I want to draw your attention to is the fact that one of the important aspects for us competition authority was the access to data. And more specifically, I guess that at home you have, these devices that connect you to the television. These devices obviously process a lot of data, and they know quite a lot about, what you are doing with your television. And obviously, that was a concern to us. And I guess that, this comes back to these questions about data is, can you compete as a TV broadcaster if you compete with people basically who have access to data about their viewers, but also about your viewers, and when they have somehow immediate access? And so basically, the competition college, so the decision body of the competition authority, held that the control of platforms, and we speak here about dominant platforms, and that's maybe important, over data requires the special attention of competition authorities. And so when they emphasize this idea that one broadcaster, one television could have access to much more detailed data about their users and about competing the data of competing channels. But so in terms of remedies, before we cleared the case, basically we had long discussions, but very long discussions about the kind of data access. And so basically the bottom line is, it is present at the Commission, these questions about data, but it is also present in smaller competition authorities like ours. And I think that everyone, in the network knows that the future is about, how data and competition are related. And so coming back to the broad picture, basically, I think, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion today, because you will have a kind of an attempt to further dig into, the relation between data and competition. And I think, again, as a practitioner, for us, it's really useful that people take these discussions, these questions to the data, that people try to model the relation between competition and data. And we are very lucky to have two excellent speakers about that.
We've prepared a very general presentation on data access and competition. So as mentioned right at the beginning of the conference, this is, I believe, a very important topic. It's not something academic that, you write an article and then nobody reads it and nobody cares. Perhaps that might be true, but still I believe that the topic has importance for competition authorities, for data protection agencies, and for general people who work in the industry to work. What are the strategic implications of allowing people to have access to some data and not allowing people to have access to data. So this is a research that we carried out within the chair program with the help of the financial support from the industrial sponsors that I thank now. We are finished. I'm supervising a PhD thesis on this topic. So it's a topic that's for me very important in my research. Let me start with a very general question, a very broad question. I'm not claiming that I will have an answer to that very broad question, but let me at least raise the question, and let's see how far we can go in the answer to that question. So the question is, should two types of policy be carried out independently of each other? The two policies that I'm talking about are data regulations and competition policy. So in Europe, we have a very strong regulation on personal data. It's called the GDPR, General Directive on Regulation of what is General Data Protection Regulation. Sorry, that's very very strict. We must say it. We had a law in France that's called Loi Informatique et Liberté, and this regulation go one step further in protecting personal data. And aside from that regulation, we have, as in most industrial countries, in most industrial areas, economic areas, we have also authorities that deal with competition issues between firms. And currently, I'm sure they talk to each other. I'm not claiming that they do not talk to each other, but it seems that when a decision is made about competition policies, such as mergers or acquisitions, data issues are raised, they're raised, but there seems to be something in the background. Okay, it seems to be that it might be an issue, but it's not the issue that people look at when they review a merger case or an acquisition phase. Let me give you these three examples. So recently, I think it was a couple of years ago, Facebook purchased WhatsApp. And there was, when you read the decision of the Commission, there is a discussion about data, but that was not the concerns about the merging different sources of data. Well, that was an issue, but that was not enough to prevent this acquisition. And when you read the decision, the guidelines that you can try to guess from that decision is that they were operating on two separate markets, and there was not really a discussion about, okay, they have data on this market and data on that market, but if you merge the two data, maybe some things happen. That discussion is not very clear from the decision that I read. Same thing about Google and DoubleClick. These are data companies. They make money out of data. And again, when you read the decision of the Commission, data it's a concern, but it's not enough to make a decision to prevent the merger or to prevent the acquisition. You look at all these cases that Alexis mentioned, data is always raised as a concern, but it's not the leading factor that influences the final outcome of the decision. So, as a first analysis, if you want to answer the question, is yes, it seems that we can carry out these two types of policies separately. Okay, let's go one step further. Let's look at the report that we mentioned earlier, the report by Jacques Kremer that came out in a couple of months ago. It was, and data is mentioned. There is a section on that. But when you read the section in the question, you see that it's considered as a barrier to entry. It will prevent some startups to innovate and to enter the market or to join an ecosystem. What I want to say today is something very different. I want to say that this analysis is too short-sighted. And I'm going to try to convince you that it's not just a problem of a barrier to entry, it's at the core of competition policy in the digital era. Because data to access will, as you will see, and I will try to argue, it will change the way competition operates on the market. And so it means that you have to look at data issues when you look at competition issues. So that's my agenda. I want to try to convey that message. So first of all, what's different about data than about, I don't know, any other industry? Why is it different? Well, there are some specific features, okay? You have one data set, you have another data set, you merge them, it's not just 1 + 1. Why? Because there is an intersection. You have customers here, you have customers there, you merge them, there will be customers that are part of the two data sets. What does it mean? Is that I have more information on this intersection. So I have more information about these people. And this has a lot of economic value. A lot, of course. Because I have more personal information about them. Before I had two separate pieces of information. Now I know much more about these individuals that are in the intersection. What it means? Well, it means that you have increased economic value from when you merge two data sets, when there is an intersection. And also that it will be easier to monetize. And then there is a risk of market dominance due to data mergers. And I'm just saying this without any model. This is a feature of data sets, that when you merge data sets, you will get more precise information about customers. Second reason why data issues are different from other issues is the fact that when you sell data, and now I'm coming to my topic of data brokers, when you sell data, you can give some competitive advantage to people. It's very easy to understand. I will explain that with some figures, but let's say I have this room, I divide the room into two groups. A group on my left, group on my right. I give information to people on my left about the market, about customers. And to people on the right, I don't give any information. And after that, you compete on the product market. Well, you are going to have a problem. It's going to be very difficult to compete with these guys because you have less information about the customers. They have information about the market, the customers, you don't. they have clearly a competitive advantage over you. And this is due to my strategy, my data strategy. It's because I give them information and I didn't give them to you, that you now have a competitive disadvantage. So it's very also clear and easy to understand that the strategies of the data broker, the way the data broker is going to sell information, is going to have an impact on product market competition. And I will show that in a few moments. Third reason why it's interesting to look at data issues, and that data issues are relatively new compared to other classical issues, is that we tend to think about competition on this digital market as competition carried out by two-sided platforms. You have a platform that controls access to the resources on the platform. That could be user-generated content, for instance, YouTube or Google or Facebook. And then you have advertiser, and then you have users, and then the advertisers, they want to join a platform when there are many users so that they can reach a larger audience. And so you have these network externalities. You want to go to a dominant platform because you have a higher likelihood to find the right audience for your product. So that's the way we tend to think about this competition on this market. But now data brokers, they are adding a new dimension. What is the new dimension? Is that now it's not just competition in a market, but you can also connect different markets. Why? Because before, again, you had no information about all the other markets. Like you only know your market, but then a data broker comes to your office and say, look, you are missing some customers because in fact there is another market where people would buy your product. And now currently there is only one seller on that market. So if I sell you information about this customer, then you can start to reach them and sell your products. That's a different story. That's not the same story as the two-sided platforms. The two-sided platform is still within the market. You are in the market for social networks or for advertising. But now you can connect a market in a country with a market in another country, thanks to the internet. And so we are moving from two-sided markets to what we call now connected markets. So these markets were not connected before because they were geographically separated or for any other reasons. But now that there are data brokers that have information about everybody, they can start to connect this market, and that would increase competition on these markets. 3 reasons. There are perhaps more. For me, this is enough to start a project on this topic. So this is a document that was published by the New York Times, I think, a couple of years ago. It was a document that leaked from a UK Parliament hearing about Facebook. If you've good eyes, you can read this. So basically, Facebook allowed third-party applications, apps, to have access to Facebook customers' data, and prevented other apps. I think the app that was mentioned was Vine. I'm not using any of these products, so I have no idea what it is, but the main point is that they favored some firms and they made it harder for other firms to have access to customer data. And for me, this is a problem. This is a competition problem. It's not a data problem. It's a competition problem. So what's new when you look at this question from economics perspective? So yes, the question about information competition, this is a very old question. Adam Smith, Justin Adam Smith, that's all major economic thinker has written on this topic. It's a central question: is how information is gonna influence how market works. This is nothing new. What's new now is that people tend to think this as, main visible or something, an exogenous process. But now we have firms specializing in selling information. That's new. That was not the case, let's say, 20 or 30 years ago. It has always existed, but now it has reached proportions that are very important. So let me try to argue this. Let me try to give you an example. So this is a data leak, data breaches. And I don't want to talk about data breach because we have one every day nowadays. I just want to point to the numbers that you read on top of the first line. It's 120 million. So the 120 million customer data was leaked, was hacked, went to the darknet. We don't know if it's the total amount of data that this data broker had, but it just gives you the amount of information that the data broker has on US customers. So the US customers is 250, 300 million. So it's basically half of the US adult population, even more, that this particular data broker had information on. That's huge, okay? There are many of these data brokers, and they're all big. I mean, big in the sense that they have a lot of information about a customer. So this is another hack, another data breach that was really commented on because, Equifax is a credit scoring company, so they use your data to give you a credit score to see if you can be trusted to reimburse a loan, okay? And why people wrote about this case is that there was a data breach, but if you want to check that your data was stolen, you had to pay a fee to to check that your data was not stolen. So it was kind of controversial. Look at the numbers: 2.4 million additional customer data went into the nature, on top of the 147.9 million that was already leaked in the first estimation. More than 150 million. Okay, that's huge. That's basically not all adult US population, but pretty close to it. So it means that these data brokers, they are not just small players collecting coupons and purchasing habits of customers in the grocery store. That's not it. This is much bigger. This is basically companies that have access to data on basically every US adult citizen. It's a different story. And to answer my main question, how are data regulation and competition policy related? I have to answer these three questions. And these are not easy questions. These are not easy because we had to work a lot. There were very few references in the literature, so we had to do some original research to try to answer the questions. So the three questions I'm going to try to answer are the following. Why does a data broker collect information? Why does it sell it? And what are its selling strategies? And how does information on the market, how does information sold to firms influence competition on the market? Okay, I'll try to answer these questions. So let me give you a very simple idea of how it works. And if you understand the next 3 slides, you will understand, I think, the rest of my presentation. So let me go slow. So let's say you have two sellers. They could sell anything. It doesn't matter here. They are selling flights. You have customers on this line, and the consumer on the left, they prefer Aeroflot, and the customer on the right, they prefer to use Eastern Airways for whatever reason. Doesn't matter. So this consumer is here because he's indifferent between going to this company or that company. He doesn't care. They prefer to go here, and the one on the right, they prefer to go to Eastern Airways. Okay, so what happens if you have no information? If the airline companies have no information, what will they do? Well, they have no information. They cannot distinguish customers, so they will put a unique price. There will be only one price for the tickets, because they don't know that they are tourists, that they are businessmen, that they have no idea about the customers, so there will be only one price on the market. And competition will not be very strong. Why? Because they cannot identify the relevant consumer. They don't know if they are here or there. If they knew they were here, then this company would fight very fiercely to have them, because they are ready to pay more for my product. But if I have no information, I'm not going to compete very strongly on this market because I have no information. So now let's look at what happens in the other extreme case. Let's say that I have this type of information. So I know that each customer can belong to one of these small segments. I don't know exactly where he is on one segment, but I know he belongs to this segment, to that segment, and so on. And suppose that the two firms know this. Well, now competition is going to be extremely tough. Why? Because before I was basically fighting for the indifferent consumers and competition was not very strong. Now I'm competing for every consumer on every segment. That's a very different situation. Now, in this situation, competition is very strong. In the previous situation, competition is very soft. And what's the difference between the two graphs? Is the amount of information. Here, there is much more information than in the previous case. In fact, in my first case, there was no information. Here, I have very precise information on my customers. So that's the first effect of information on competition. When you give information to competing firms, they will compete more fiercely. Okay? And why do they do that? Why do they compete more fiercely? Because let me use this. The same graph. Because they have more information. But why do they purchase information? Because they will have now. Aeroflot knows that they know all the customers who are in this area, and that's very important. Why? Because these are the guys who are ready to pay more for my product. So it's very important to know who are these guys. Now that I have this information, it means that I will be able to charge them a higher price because they are ready to pay more for my product. The same is true for people on the right. Okay? So what we see now is that there will be two effects of information on competition. First effect is the first that I mentioned, but more information on the market, firms will compete more fiercely because they know exactly who are the customers that are interested in the product, and they can reach also customers that they didn't know were interested in the product. So they will compete more fiercely. But on the other hand, if I have more information, I will be able to charge more for those who want to purchase my product, who have a higher willingness to pay for my product, and this is good for me because I will make more profits. So you see that there are these two effects. You cannot separate them. In fact, we show in the article that we have them in equilibrium. So I think I have a slide for this. Yes. So when there is more information, there will be a trade-off. So there will be more competition on the market, but there will be more surplus extraction. And now if you're an economist, you have guessed that there will be an equilibrium and that it will not be optimal to sell all customer data on this market. If you're not an economist, let me go more slowly with this. Okay, so now let's say I don't want to sell all customer segments that are available. Then let's say, why not selling this type of information? So I can identify people here in these segments, in this, and this. Okay, I can identify customers on each of these segments. And the question that I'm going to ask, if I can do that for any information structure, so let's say I'm free to choose which information structure I want to sell to the firms. Will I choose the one on top? Okay, let me repeat, sorry. Let's say I can choose any information structure that I want to sell to firms. Is it optimal to sell all consumer segments to firms? And the answer, if you are quick enough, is of course no. You are not going to sell all consumer segments to firms. Why? Because you are increasing the competitive pressure on the market. And that's not good for you because the firms have to pay for the information that you're going to sell to them. And if you give them low profits because there is too much competition on the market, they are not going to pay a lot of money for your information. And so it's not optimal to sell all customer segments for the data brokers because it's not going to maximize its profit. Remember that the data broker wants to make money. He wants to sell, he sells data to make money. So if there is too much competitive pressure on the market, the firms will make less profits and the data broker will make less profit because the firms are ready to pay less for the information sold by the data broker. So what's going to happen in equilibrium? This is what's going to happen. So the data broker is going to sell information on the consumer segments that are closest to the firm, and then it will not sell information on all the other consumers. Why? Because by doing so, you can still make them pay a higher price, and here you avoid competitive pressure because you don't allow the firms to identify consumers. So that's new. People in the literature before us thought that selling all consumer segment was, they didn't even ask the question, is it optimal or not? They just say, why not sell all consumer segments? And we clearly identified that doing so is not optimal because you put too much competitive pressure on the market, and then the firms are ready to pay less for your information. So that's my first key message. My first key message is that the data broker can increase or decrease the intensity of competition on the product market by selling more or less information. So if the data broker wants to toughen competition on the market, can start to sell more information. If you want to soften competition, you can say, okay, I'm not going to sell too much of information so that firms will not compete too fiercely. So that's my first message. Now let me go to the next questions about the selling strategy. So that was part of the answer to that question. Now let me answer a slightly different questions. Well, remember my my small example a few minutes ago, I divided the room into two groups. On the left, I sell information. On the right, I don't sell information. Is it optimal to do so? Should I sell information as Facebook only to a subset of firms, a subset of apps, or should I sell information to all firms, to all apps? Clearly, in the Facebook case, that was not true. They only gave access to data to a subset of apps, and they prevented some other apps to reach information, to get information from Facebook customers. So we try to answer that question. It's not completely trivial. So what we find is that it depends on how information is sold. And that's my second key message. The way you are going to sell information, and we'll explain that in a few seconds what it means, is going to affect your data strategies, which means to which firm am I going to sell information. So let me give you two examples. So I'm going to consider two selling mechanisms, two ways to sell information to firms. The first one is through an auction. So you have, let's say, two firms that bid for customer data that you have collected as a data broker. And the bidder with the highest bid wins the auction, and the second bidder loses the auction and doesn't get information. So the winning bidder gets information, the second bidder loses the auction and doesn't get information. Well, that's a tough situation for the loser. Why is it tough? Because if you lose the auction, not only you don't have information, which is bad per se, but on top of that, your competitor has information. That's even worse. You have preferred that if I have no information, my competitor has information, competition is very soft. But now, if you lose the auction, not only you are not informed, but on top of that, the other firm is informed, and you are in the worst case scenario. That is, you're competing with someone who is informed, and you have no information about the customers. That's very punishing for the loser of this mechanism. And what's going to happen in that setting is that the data broker will sell information to only one firm. And why? It's not interesting for the data broker to sell to two firms because it can extract more surplus from the winning bidder, because the winning bidder is ready to pay more. He's willing to pay more because he knows that if he loses, it's not just competing with an uninformed firm. I'm competing with an informed firm. This is the worst case scenario for me. So I'm ready to pay a lot, to bid a lot, to avoid that situation, and the data broker can extract a lot of money from the firm, which means that it is, in most cases, optimal to sell information to only one group of firms and not sell information to the other group of firms. Now let's look at another case. Let's look at the take it or leave it offer. Take it or leave it offer, it means I'll make an offer, and if you're not interested, then nothing happens. I'm not going to sell the information to your competitor. So it's a very different story. Well, in that case, you cannot extract as much surplus to the winning bidder, because now you are not in the case, if you lose, you are not informed and the other firm is informed, but you are not informed, but your competitor is also not informed, so who cares? Well, in that case, we show that it is then optimal to sell information to the two groups in the room, to all firms. And now, I don't have to spend too much time on this. Now, this is enough to explain my key message number 2, is that the data strategy, that is how the data broker is going to sell information to the competing firms, this is going to be very important on the outcome on that market. The outcome meaning who is informed, who is not informed. And that's my second message. Now let's go back to my first question. Why do data brokers collect information? Well, they collect because they want to sell information. So it's clear that the two strategies are linked. And in fact, we show that it is indeed linked. It is normal. It couldn't be otherwise. We show that when the data broker collects more, he has incentives to sell more. That's not very surprising, but it has very strong economic implications. It means that you have a risk of snowballing effect. A snowballing effect, is you have a small snowball, and then you let it roll a hill, and then it becomes huge. It's much easier to stop a small snowball than the huge snowball that's at the end of the slope. And why is there a risk of market dominance, of data dominance? It's because when you collect more, you sell more, you can extract more surplus from the firm because you have more precise information, and that's enough. And it will be very hard to find a situation when you have less incentives to sell when you collect more. It's going to be very difficult to find a situation like that. But this has an implication. So remember, I didn't spend too much time on this, but K is the length of my consumer segment. So which means that when K is large, when you have a large number of segments, it means that the length of all segments is very small. It means that you can more easily identify consumers because you know more precisely what they are. So K basically is 1/K is the precision of the information. And so what we show is that when you increase the precision of information, that is to say, when the data broker collects more information, it can more easily put consumers into consumer segments. You have this relationship with the profits. So the profit of the data brokers start to increase until a point, and then it decreases. Let me sum up these findings. So first finding is that the data broker has a real influence on the intensity of competition on the market, much more than what previous researchers thought they would have. The way information is sold matters. If you look at an auction or take it or leave it offer, the outcome will be very different on the market. And this last message is that you have a complex relationship between the incentive to collect and the profit of the firm. So what can we conclude from this presentation? Well, first of all, the problem is not going to go away. It's not a problem, it's just starting. Okay, why is it starting? Because now we have the Internet of Things, all these devices that are connected to cloud services that will share data, customer data with whoever is in the ecosystem. So I believe that the notion of ecosystem is even more important when you talk about the Internet of Things. You have new technologies like the blockchain. So blockchain is basically a decentralized and distributed database. The fastest growing type of blockchains are the so-called permissioned blockchains. These are blockchains that require permission before you can read data from the database, or if you want to write data to the database. So it's clear that if you give permission to some people and you don't give permission to others, we have the same issue than the issue that I raised in my talk. We have new project at the EU level where the philosophy of the European Commission is that more information on the market is good. Okay, and we have this type of initiatives, the free flow of data, trying to facilitate exchanges of data within the European economic space. We have this discussion right now about the data reuse. How, under what circumstances, in which condition should data be reproducible? Should we allow people to reuse, to re-access data? And in that case, there is a definition. It's not defined yet, but there is a discussion on how we were going to define data of general interest. We have also a discussion for a long time now about open data. Open data is exactly the same problem. We are going to reuse data that were created by someone else. So all this problem of data sharing and data selling are going to be present in all these discussions. Second point I want to make, while data regulation and competition policies can have conflicting goals. Why? Because if you look at the main regulations of the GDPR, well, you have a lot of principles about protecting privacy, like privacy by design, data minimization. So the regulation is trying to limit the amount of data, of personal data that are available on the internet, without consent, of course. There is a question of consent. But then a competition, so a data regulation authority would like to minimize personal data available to competing firms. On the other hand, if you believe what I said a few minutes ago, well, a competition authority, there would be, we have no objection for more information on the market, because when you increase the amount of information, firms compete more fiercely. And this is, let's say, good for competition policy. And so you could have a conflict between the two type of regulations and policy. Finally, I'm trying to go back to my main question: should data regulation, competition policy carried out independently of each other? And the answer is no. From our research, we clearly identified different mechanisms through which access to data can harm or increase competition. So clearly, I'm not saying that we should merge the different authorities. I'm just saying that it's not enough to look at these problems from one perspective or the other perspective. I think it is more important to look at these two issues at the same time. Okay, and I know that there is I'm not an expert on this, but I know there is a Facebook case in Germany, and that was exactly the argument used that was raised during that case, is that if the data was unlawfully collected, because they were collected without consent, but then you have a competition issue, because then it means that they had an unfair competitive advantage because they didn't respect the regulation that was applying to that country. And so the data issue becomes a competition policy issue. Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation. I'm going to talk about the topic, how do competition policy and data brokers shape product market competition? So this is an empirical research which is trying to catch or answer to a small fraction of this huge area of research what Alexis was talking about. So that there's an understanding now that data is important, data economy is important, data brokers are getting increasingly important, as Patrick said. But we don't have much empirical evidence, and that's basically because it's very difficult to get such a data that would allow us to research such questions. And I was lucky enough to find sufficient data for this exploration. So first of all, I don't hear what I mean about data broker. It's a company that collects and aggregates and further sells data concerning individuals and or markets. This is not the same definition as often used by media, which is typically means only personal data, not the market data. So the question is that data brokers, first of all, they increase market transparency, but also at the same time, they enable intensified information exchange among firms competing in product markets. So what we know about the economic theory and empirical evidence that there is no unambiguous answer whether competing companies' information exchange via data brokers would enhance competition or facilitate collusive behavior. And this is one of the major questions of this study and underlying these are the underlying theories behind this empirical exploration I'm going to talk about. So, as Alexis said, to understand such mechanisms is important that we can make, or you can make, in the competition authorities good decisions regarding the data brokers, data economy, and so on, sharing the data. But what I think is that I think it's really market specific, and it's really data specific. Or these questions are really data and market specific. So there's no unambiguous answer even after this study. This is just a specific market I'm going to talk about. So this is an interesting case from Finland. There was two dominant Finnish food retail companies, Sok and Kesko by names, and they used to have, now they have at least 85% market share in total, so there's an oligopoly situation in the Finnish grocery food markets. They had already about 75% market share in 2006 when we start to look at the situation. And they were not selling the data to the data broker, but the data broker was collecting data from these companies. There was another smaller one as well. They was collecting the data and giving it back to them in aggregate format and also in a detailed format, so that they could extract. They were getting also each other's data, and also they got an aggregate figures of what was happening in the food markets in different sections. But also, what the data broker did, they sold this data to the food industry. And it was actually, when I started to do this study, I didn't realize how important this was to food industry, but this turned to be the almost a major topic of the investigation, why it was so important to food industry. And what I'm looking at here is that what happens when these two retail companies withdrew from using the data broker and the data broker exited the market. So two questions. How it affected product market competition, and how the exit of the data broker affected the bargaining power between downstream and upstream companies. So downstream companies here are the retailers, food retailers, and upstream companies are the food suppliers, food industry. So the analysis is there are two parts in the analysis. We look at the food price development, and then the difference between the food prices and producer prices for food before and after this data broker exited Finnish market. And we use as a control group other Europe 15 countries. To make you understand the whole story is that I have to tell you a little bit about what kind of data this data broker was collecting. This was AC Nielsen, which is functioning in more than 100 countries at the moment. So it was collecting store-level point of sales data directly from food retailers. It was very detailed, value, unit of sales, segment, producer, brand, own label products, so on, national and regional level. They got all the detailed data of all the all the shopping of each individual, basically, who went through the cashier. So also the information was available at regional level and grouped by grocery size. And it was really comprehensive. It covered, in 2006, about 90% of trade of Finnish retailing grocery stores. And as I said, both the retailers and the industry used the data. So what happened then, which caught my attention, was that in 2007, this part is a direct translation from Finnish text in the FCCI's decision in 2008, which tells that what happened in February 2007, both SOK and Kesko, they contacted a Finnish competition authority, and they were really worried about that there might be a competition problem, that they are sharing this information via a data broker. And I thought that this was quite exceptional in the sense that I have heard about that if there is a cartel cases, then one of those goes to the competition authority to tell that, okay, we have a cartel, to avoid the damage. Or how do you call this? Cartel punishment. Exactly. So here was nothing like that. They were not. They went both at the same time and asked them to do investigation. So that was curious, first of all. So at the same time, same month, one of them, Kesko, released a stock exchange that was telling that about this reporting, which I found also quite curious to make a stock exchange news about the such information inquiry to Finnish Competition Authority and the starting of the investigation. Okay, here is the decision in 2008. So what FCCI decided was that, concluded that this exchange of confidential information, which was very detailed, shall be considered to have potential harmful effects on competition, and therefore constitutes a violation of the Competition Act and Article 81 EC. But they didn't impose any fine to the companies because they have started the investigation themselves. And in addition to that, they had both stopped using this data broker. Meanwhile, SOK terminated the use of Nielsen Scantrack. I think it was a couple of months before the decision. So, as I said, that there was some importance of this to also the food industry. And that I learned from the Food Industry Association of Finland. There was a person who called me and was telling me about these developments during the 10 years, and I started to read papers. And there was, in February 2011, there was news of the Finnish Food Industry Association that after this Scantrack service use was ending, and they lacked information of the grocery retail market sales, detailed sales and price data. Here is the news translated. So what they did, they were building up their own monitoring system, that kind of tracking service to replace Scantrack. But it was, of course, you couldn't build as detailed information channel as was what you get from directly from the sales from the grocery cashiers. So this new tool was not as detailed or comprehensive, and they got data from the groceries, SOK and Kesko, who sold it, but they didn't sell it as detailed level either. So if you were, for instance, a meat producer, you were able to get the aggregate figures on certain markets, but you didn't get the detailed information of the subsectors, or you didn't get the detailed any information about the markets that were substitutes to meat. So they couldn't really use that data as well to optimize their own production or forecast how the markets are developing. So then there was a change in Competition Act in January 2014, which made in daily consumer goods trade a firm to be in a dominant position if it had at least 30% market share, which was applying both to SOC and Kesko. So as a consequence of that, these guys, these Finnish Food Association people, they contacted FCCA and they were pressing them that they might be using there might be abuse of dominant position, in this case, in the information sharing, that they do not share enough information to the industry or suppliers. And they started an investigation, which was concluded 2016 June, and they were investigating basically two questions: whether these retailers were obliged to disclose sales data to their suppliers on different terms than they did at that time. And second, whether they were obliged to disclose sales data to data sharing operators. And FCCI concluded that there's no reason to take any further action or investigate the matter. So they didn't see any major problem there. So after this story, which is I think it's interesting case study, I was studying. I started to think about how to capture this phenomenon empirically, how to study how this data brokers exit affected market competition. And I went to the look at, of course, what the theoretical literature says about the topic and the economics. I'm an economist, by the way. So first of all, there's very scarce literature on the impacts of data brokers on competition. This Booney et al. Paper is actually exactly the paper which Patrick has been involved with, and he was telling about actually I don't have to go to this story about all these details, because he was explaining in detail how about these profit maximizing data brokers strategies and how it affects the competition. So basically, in this kind of situation, when both retailers buy information from data broker, more information induces them to compete more fiercely and reduces firms' profit compared to the situation when neither of the firms bought market information. This was explained in the figure of the Patrick, where there was this price discriminating data broker, and they had information about all these consumer segments, detailed information. Second source of literature is industrial organization literature. This is much more wider. It's about the impacts of information exchange generally on product market competition and collusion. But it doesn't provide any ambiguous answer to the question whether more information softens or tightens competition. There are different forces in action, or let's say that there are different theories what could happen. So basically, if a firm gets more detailed consumer information, you can price discriminate and get more surplus from consumers and get higher profits. On the other hand, if there's a market transparency, that the consumers, they can compare better the prices, and they see or observe price changes which may facilitate competition, since firms have an incentive to set lower prices. So, and this further is well-known fact that in oligopolistic markets, price discrimination often leads to intensified competition and also lower profits for firms, which means of course that consumer welfare increases due to lower prices. And then the third literature talks about collusions. And this is a very large literature, which I don't know how many of you are lawyers or are involved in the collusions, cartels, and so on. Not many? Okay, so the idea here is that when competitors exchange information, which is horizontal information exchange, that may facilitate collusion, coordinated actions, which means coordinated actions to avoid competition and to gain higher profits for themselves. Because they can coordinate their prices to a level that provides companies higher than competitive profits. So they can raise prices higher than they would be in a competitive markets. Furthermore, when they exchange information, they can monitor what each other does, and then it makes it easier for them to maintain this kind of collusive situation. And now when we go to data markets, what algorithms does, they do increase transparency and also accuracy with which firms can detect price changes. And also they enable faster price responses, and the firms are able to better predict how their competitors are reacting and what kind of strategies they are having. So based on that, both data brokers and algorithm use, they may increase the power of oligopolistic competitors to charge higher than competitive prices, which is supra-competitive prices. So these three strands of literature is used to build the major hypothesis of this empirical investigation. The first is that when there is a data broker in a market, competition tends to be softer and product prices higher when these firms exchange information, competitors exchange information, than it would be without the presence of data broker. The second hypothesis and third hypothesis are relying on the Patrick's paper, or Patrick's and his co-authors, that saying that on it's the opposite result, that when there's a data broker, competition is fiercer and product price is lower than it would be without the presence of data broker. And then the third one, actually, I'm not going to talk about this in the empirical results, so I just skip it. Then there is very, very, very narrow literature, not much theoretical studies done about this topic, downstream collusion when companies have buyer power. There is only a couple of studies published in the internationally refereed articles about this topic. And there's Doyle and Hahn 2012, which says that if there's a buyer group, this facilitates collusion in the output market. So if for instance, different grocery chains, they join and they make acquisitions from abroad together, this is likely to increase the chance of risk of collusion. And then there is Piccolo and Miklo-Stahl paper 2012, which is that upstream firms' bargaining power makes downstream collusion more difficult. So as these upstream and downstream firms must share industry profits to prevent each other from contract deviations. So basically, when there was a termination of information exchange from retailers to suppliers after market exit of data broker, that might increase collusion risk and higher competitive pricing, which leads us to the fourth hypothesis. So basically, we are testing these four hypotheses in the empirical part of the study, trying to look at what are the competitive effects of the data broker and its exit from the market. The data is, there's a dependent variable. It's a quarterly country level price index for consumer price index for food among European 15 countries. And then we have also it in more detailed in 6 subcategories, there were more subcategories available in the dataset, but not data from Finland, so it was not possible to make the estimation because Finland is the country of interest. And then there's a third one is the difference in the consumer and producer price indices for food. Here you can see a picture of what happened. I don't know, this is so bad quality that I think you can't see the years, but what was happening with the food prices, these flat ones here, the yellow and the blue one are the consumer prices for non-food items in Finland, and the other one is in other European 15 countries. As you can see, these remain pretty flat. And then, sorry, yellow and the gray one. And then this red one is the consumer prices in Finland for food, and the blue one is consumer prices for food in other countries. Here you can see what happens is this is the time before FCCA started investigation, when there was a information exchange both between the retailers and the suppliers. It seems that there is probably quite fierce competition among Finnish companies because the price development stays lower than in the other European Union countries. Then here what happens is that FCCA investigation starts, and also Kesko, one of the companies, terminates Scantrack use. After a while we see that food prices started to rise. Then there's FCCA decision, they rise even more sharply. And this is the time actually when there was an economic recession starting and pushing prices down elsewhere. But in Finland they kept on going up, which is quite curious. But of course, this is just a figure. We have not controlled any of the factors. There could be some increase in wages, increases in other costs, increases in value-added taxes, so on. So we can't make any conclusions about this picture. So what we do is we make an estimation of the model. And I don't know how many of you are mathematical people. Okay, so I skipped the model and I explain what I did. We were explaining these food prices and difference between food prices and producer prices. That was the dependent variable, what variation we were explaining. And we were using here, this is like pre-treated. This is a variable which tells, gets value 1 for the time when there was both horizontal and vertical retail information exchange. So both retailers and the suppliers got information from Scantrack. And the treated means this is concerned Finnish companies. So we get here, this estimate for alpha tells actually how much different Finnish food prices were during that time in Finland as compared to other countries, these control group countries. The same here, post one. It's the time when there was merely no horizontal information exchange, but there was that was before there was FCC's decision, and so there was still vertical information exchange, at least from those companies that were using Scantrack. So that tells the difference between Finnish food prices and other countries' food pricing during this time period. And then there's the third one, post 2, which tells how much Finnish food prices differed after the FCC's decision on average from the other countries' food price development. And also we controlled, if you read the literature, there are other factors which affect the food prices. They are value-added tax, agricultural commodity prices, labor cost, energy, private labor share, and so on. We controlled all these factors to make sure that they don't cause this difference between the prices of Finnish food and other countries. So here is the estimation result. So how you read this is, what did I do? How you read this is that, okay, this is the estimation for the short term, 2005, 2009. Then there is the long-term estimates. You see that what I have bolded is highly statistically significant, so at the level of 0.01. These not bolded are not really statistically significant findings. So basically, the prices in Finland didn't differ statistically significantly from those of other countries, not before there was a FCCS decision, and there was no information exchange via data broker in Finland. So this says that then after that, in the short term, or relatively short term, the deviation of the prices was about 5%. So in Finland, food prices rose about 5% more than in other countries. And this is just so and so statistically significant, so we can't make any long-term conclusions. Here, this is a bit different table because I couldn't, it would have been a too long table, so I was making estimations for different food groups. And what we found here is that basically there was not a permanent increase in food prices in the long term in any of these groups. So this is the estimates for those time when after the FCCS decision. There seems to be some groups where in Finland food prices got a bit lower, but instead, shorter term, we can see that in Finland there was bread and cereal, meat, milk, cheese and eggs, oil and fat, of which price increased for 1.5 years after this FCCS decision. And these are actually the groups that were part of the Scantrack system. They were collected by Scantrack, while Scantrack didn't collect data from fruit and vegetables. So it's quite interesting. There was no change in those prices. And what comes to the producer prices, or difference between producer prices and consumer prices, we can see that the effect was both after there was a notable difference between consumer and producer prices both after FCCS decision, and already you can see the effect when there was no horizontal retail info exchange when Kesko withdraw using the system. Okay. So we didn't find any statistically significant difference in general food price development from 2005 until early 2007 between Finland and the other European Union 15 countries. And also what we can say for sure that we can reject this traditional collusion hypothesis we were testing. So then we can ask, so what then explains larger increase in consumer prices for food in Finland after the exit of data broker than in the control group? And I'm not sure. I have various potential explanations, and one is this theoretical research. One is provided by this theoretical research which concerns data brokers' impact on competition. So hypothesis 2. So our data supports this hypothesis 2 for short term, 1.5 years after market exit of data broker, but we don't find any clear long-term evidence on this price increase. And I was thinking about that if this theory would hold, what would explain that there is no longer-term increase in prices? And one explanation is that both these retail groups, they developed their own market monitoring tools for sure, I know, and they were also developing very strongly their loyal customer systems. And this could have replaced Scantrac's detailed consumer information and then increased competition, what would be, again, according to the data broker theory, right? A second one is that was there a collusion maybe between the retail groups? First of all, if you think about the story, they coordinated and they contacted simultaneously FCCI, telling that they are concerned that there are potential antitrust issues in their own use of Scantrack system, which is quite funny. And they terminated its use even before FCCI made its decision. And as you look at the data and the estimation results, you can see that they had an incentive to terminate the use of Scantrack. After that, there was less fierce price competition and clearly higher food prices, so they made more profits. So that would be quite credible that they coordinated to decrease transparency of food prices. And if you look at the other literature, empirical literature on these kind of issues or topics about the transparency of food prices, there is a paper of Ader and Rigby. And they found that when there was a new regulation in Israel that obligated these supermarket chains to post all their prices online, prices were declining. It was the media interest, there were also news services which were comparing prices in different stores and so on. So it was really beneficial for consumers. Also, if you look at the order of magnitude of overcharges which we got in different food categories, we got like 2.5 to 10%. This would be in line with at least a couple of studies which were done about market collusion concerning consumer products. There was one study for detergents in Germany, which found close to 7% overcharge, and then another one published in a quite good journal, I can't remember which one, but which found that when there was a Brazilian food retail carton, the overcharge of gasoline was between 4.6 and 6.6, and up to 12% of ethanol. So it's about the same size category. Furthermore, collusions, they tend to break down by themselves, as there is always incentive to cheat. So in this case, there would be an incentive for the competitor to cheat in a sense that they would decrease their own prices because they were competing at that time very strongly about the market shares. So to increase their own market shares and profits. So, but what happens is that cheater gets punishments. So the punishment is this fierce competition. And then that is breaking down the collusion agreement, implicit or explicit. That would explain why there was a relatively short-term price increase. And furthermore, they had incentive for this collusion because we found out that gap between producer and consumer prices increased when upstream firms, those food industry suppliers, lost their access to detailed retail sales and price data. So they had a lot of incentive to get rid of Scantrack or Nielsen in the market. Furthermore, it seems likely that they were able to increase their bargaining power in relation to suppliers when the suppliers lost the detailed market information. Couldn't see what kind of prices exactly were asked in the markets. Then I was calculating also damage to consumers using these estimates in different food categories. And for 1.5 years, when there seems to be a overcharge for food in Finland, damage was on average about 600 million. And within 95% confidence interval between 365 and 834 million euros, which is, I think it's for 1.5 years, it's quite a lot. Of course, there are a lot of consumers, so it explains the, or households, explains these findings. So to conclude, I found two types of incentives for retail groups to terminate detailed sales information delivery via data broker, to avoid competition, and then that they were able to hide this information from the food industry, what the food industry was able to buy before, and they were bargaining by that. So this tells that if you think about algorithms generally, that facilitating horizontal information exchange may not necessarily reduce competition, but I would say not necessarily, because this is only one market area, and it might concern only these kind of markets which face a lot of consumer and media interest. So, like in this Israeli case, when these grocery prices were put to the internet, so there were new companies analyzing the prices. There was more information for consumers, and so, of course, then if you see that consumers see in the internet that you are pricing much higher than your competitor, you might want to maybe change the image by lowering the prices or the competing different strategies. I think the other interesting lesson from this is that when the consumer prices are transparent, it also might affect functioning of supply chains, suppliers. So when in this case, when the producers were able to get the detailed sales and price information, they were able to predict market development more precisely and optimize their production. And if you think about that nowadays, largest companies, they already can buy and use data analytics and algorithms. That would benefit probably mostly the smaller manufacturers. But if you look at the statistics about in Europe or in Finland, it's quite a small number or share of companies which is utilizing data analytics or big data. Still, it's mostly large companies. Among large companies, it can go up to 50% of companies, but if you go to smaller categories, it decreases very fast. So even though we talk about, there's a hype about data analytics, so on, it's very underexploited in European firms. And I think also that this is for economists, that is interesting that we have been focusing mostly on the horizontal price transparency, but this shows that also vertical price transparency may matter and have substantial competitive implications. And I think now one major lesson from this is that this really shows that the data brokers matters, the data economy matters. It can have implications not only for product market competition, but also for the relationships or competition between suppliers and the downstream and upstream firms, and also the bargaining power between them. But this is just a small piece of research, and we definitely need much more to understand how these dynamics take place in different industries and different markets and using different data. Thank you.
Hello, I am Karine Diver, I'm a lawyer, and I am specialized in personal data. And maybe because of that specialization, I am a little bit surprised by the fact that I expected that you will talk more about the the possible evolution of the business model of data broker with the GDPR. And in fact, I have read I have read that one of the biggest data broker left European Union because of the GDPR and went back to US. And that is just a first point. And about my way to think here, I have the impression that most of the market of data broker is simply no more in compliance, compliant with GDPR, because we don't have the possibility as a consumer to oppose to the collect of the data. I'm so sorry, it is my English of the evening, but in the morning it is wonderful.
If you feel better speaking in French, please do.
Oh, merci. Mais c'était quand même intelligible. Oui, merci beaucoup. C'était intelligible.
Non, tout à fait.
Oui.
Vous
voulez que je résume, je synthétise la question?
Si, en 2 minutes si vous voulez, mais sinon moi je l'ai bien comprise.
D'accord.
Et so basically I guess that Patrick, that's maybe more for you.
I can try to answer. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to give you all the details, but there is a reason why the data brokers don't want to stay in Europe. Is because the regulation, the data regulation, is stronger than in the US. That might change in the future because there are projects to have similar regulation in the US. I think there is also things very similar to the GDPR in California. Other states are thinking about implementing this type of regulation, but I'm speaking for the lawyers now in the room. But under GDPR, if you are a data protection specialist, so under GDPR you have a lot of obligations and principles that protect your personal data, and you need to get the consentment of the person. You need to be able to correct mistakes. There must be a finality. I don't know how to say that, but there must be a goal for the treatment of the handling of the data. There are many obligations, and it is clear that the data brokers, even they don't have the tool, they're not willing to follow such regulation. So I mentioned this funny example where the Equifax example where customer had to pay a fee to check whether their own data was stolen, which is kind of completely. If you think about it, it's crazy.
My perspective, so as a competition specialist, I would say 2 things. First of all, I'm not sure that we know exactly what will be the consequences of GDPR as now, because the interaction between data, what is possible, what is not possible, and competition, as we have just heard from the economists, we don't know yet what exactly this interaction will look like. And I think that as a policymaker, we still don't know either how this interaction will develop. Certainly in the case I referred to on Belgium, when we designed the remedies, it was extremely carefully designed, especially because of GDPR. And so there is this interaction that you can feel starts already, but the link is still not. We will have wait for the development of these interactions. Second, discussion that we have not had, because you launched the discussions that we have not had, is the interaction between the platform P2B regulation, the platform regulation of the Commission, and the competition policy among about platforms. And so that will have a link as well with GDPR, because a number of things will not be permissible anymore on the B2B side, so the platform to business, the B2B side of these platforms, and that will maybe have an influence as well. All that to say that indeed there are plenty of areas for future research, and I guess that the kind of discussion we have now is only I guess exploratory to some sense, and therefore it's good also to have researchers who have had access to data for some ideas and put them into models, and to launch a couple of maybe exploratory but conclusions already.
Yeah, I totally agree with you about that. And also the shorter term impacts and longer term impacts might be totally different. And for instance, now when Facebook, Zuckerberg said that he thinks that he agrees with GDPR and a stronger regulation. And that raises a question whether such a powerful person could also impact a regulation in the United States to that direction. So maybe United States is going the same direction as Europe. But on the other hand, short-term impacts might be, for certain firms, they might be negative. I saw a paper about, there's an empirical research about the how implementation of GDPR in European Union affected venture capital investments of high-tech startup companies. Those kind of companies that potentially exploit personal data, as compared to those similar companies in the United States. And it seemed, at least temporarily, they got much less venture capital investments than the comparison group in the United States. So these are one example of these kind of effects that appear, and some people might not have been able to expect, or maybe expect, but we didn't know what is the order of magnitude of those, and we need a lot of research about such effects.
Hi, Winston Maxwell from Telecom Paris. I wanted to just reinforce that too about the unexpected effects of regulation. I think I read it in the French Competition Authority report on online advertising. They also made the comment that the cookie regulation, or the future e-privacy regulation that's now in discussion, and I think the GDPR, I'm not sure they mentioned, paradoxically, it hits hard the small independent publishers, and it doesn't hit so hard the big, Facebooks and Google, which is exactly what you're saying. Maybe regulation of the style of GDPR and the cookie regulation has a disproportionate competitive impact on the smaller players as opposed to the bigger platforms, which is not an obvious outcome, but one that people should focus on, I think.
Again, it's obviously, these kind of regulations will have to be assessed ex post, and I guess that it would be for the researchers amongst you. It's a beautiful area of research, because you will have quite a lot of attention within a couple of years when people will try to assess the effects of this regulation. But I guess it was more a comment than a question.
I agree with you. I think that the big players in the tech industry, they were ready, because they have lawyers. The small startups and the smaller companies, I'm pretty sure of it. They don't even know what the GDPR is. So for them, of course, it's a problem. But this is I think an interesting point, is that we talk about GDPR, we take it for granted, we assume that everybody knows about it, but it's in fact, when you look at the real situation in the industry, we know that it's not the case. So we have the number from the INSEE for 2015, if I remember correctly. Only 75%, only 25%, sorry, of firms in the French industry have an official data policy, meaning that they are compliant with the law, loi informatique et liberté, which is a really small number, and these are of course all the big companies. So there is a problem of education, there is a problem of knowledge about all these data issues, and I think that's why it's important to communicate on these topics.
And for those of you who watch us online, this is the first time in my life, but I really signed that I agree that you can watch me online.
No, I almost forgot what I was about to say, but I think it was about these large competitors. Yes, what came to my mind to your comment is that that applies at least the very largest ones like GAFA, Microsoft. For one reason at least, there might be many other reasons, but they don't have the eggs in the one basket. They have searched ways they have invested in research and development in financial sector, health sector, automation, robotics, in factories, logistics, so on. They have invested in so many areas that if it fails in one area, they can keep on pushing in the other areas. I think that's probably they have buffers, I would think.
Yes, good evening, Guy de Felcourt. I want to ask you a question because during your talk you assumed that, I mean, I interpreted perhaps not rightly, but I understood that you assumed that data brokerage is bringing more transparency in the market and therefore more competition, good competition effect. But what we see is that data brokerage, for instance, public administration, they have a file for, let's say, driving license. I'm talking both in the United States and also in many states of Europe. And they would like to make money with it. So they cannot do it directly, so they will look at the data broker and they will provide it for the data broker to sell and bring some money to them. And there are many also from the internet companies. We've seen it with Cambridge Analytica, we've seen it with Experian, many Equifax. There are many that they handle the data to the data broker because it's not so transparent, so they can make the data business a little bit hidden. So isn't it a kind of paradox between the position you assume and this practice on the market? And how do you see the evolution of this practice on the light of GDPR, but also perhaps other things?
I don't see it as a paradox. I think it's very market specific. And in this specific situation, what I was talking about, when there were these two dominant retail companies, that meant what this data broker allowed was basically the same as they would have been exchanging in collusion a detailed data, basically. But because of this price discrimination effect that Patrick was talking about, that actually ended up to the fiercer competition than with the presence of data broker. So I think this is a very market-specific question, and as I said, that we don't have any in economics, or not in theory and not in the empirical findings. There is no unambiguous answers how information exchange affect in different markets, different situations. So, and can I continue a bit? And then what about the future? I think algorithms will eventually be replacing many of these data brokers. It's mainly utilized, as I said, it's the large firms who can afford investment in people who have capabilities of doing data analytics and also programmers, so on. But it will be expanding also to the smaller firms later on. And then who knows what happens? Depends on the market, I think.
Thank you very much for your contribution, interesting contribution. Well, I agree on the fact that data regulation and competition are not independent. My concern focus the kind of data that are now exchanged and especially affect an emotion. It's not price, it's other value. And I would like to know about the data brokers' involvement. Do they send and to what extent they buy and sell emotion data? First question. And to what extent data brokers they can sell and exchange emotion data of private or public interest? And the last question, what should be the ethical safeguard in the future, you know, further the GDPR regulation to protect consumer data, at the same time to, you know, protect fair competition?
Okay, it's a very difficult question. So first question is whether emotional data, if I understand correctly, are personal data. If they are not personal data, then the regulation does not apply. So I'm not a lawyer, but I would say that emotions are necessarily attached to a person. So in that sense, it should be a personal data, and then the regulation applies. Then the GDPR applies, and all personal data regulations applies. But you raise a very good, important point, is that now we have more complex data. We have data that still can be easily classified as personal data, but now we have also behavioral data. During lunch, we were mentioning behavioral biometrics, you know, algorithms that detect the way you walk. And we know that Google and all the companies are working on this type of algorithms. So they can also have what we call metadata about you, not just data about you, but also about your emotions, the way you walk, the way you type on the speed at which you type on the computer, where you look at the computer, the type of fonts you're using on the computer. So we know that there are a lot of other type of data that are going to be available that are not necessarily classified as personal, or not yet, or that can be combined, and this raises a lot of new, I think, issues. So if I understand correctly, as soon as there is personal data, the GDPR applies, even if there are many other type of data involved in a economic transaction. But indeed, it's interesting important, I think, to understand what are the role of other type of data on competition. Then now you mentioned. I'm not I'm not a specialist of ethics. We have philosophers in the chair, but it's indeed very important to understand also what are the implications, not just for the economy, but also for societies in general, when you can buy and sell emotional data and all the type of data that could be problematic for the society.
I don't agree with you about the question, because it's a big question. I am an expert, reviewing virtual coaching project funded by the European Commission in the health, in health applications. And I can say that emotion and affect data are personal data. But, of course, it is difficult the definition is difficult, and they are not you know, explicit in the regulation, but you must consider they are implicit. And then, you know, you can profile, you can try to profile data from voice application, from you know, face, you know, recognition, from text. So if you use Alexa, they analyze your data, your tone, and of course there is more research involved to have, you know, a good result. But they are going on, and now they are. If you see votes for voting, they are exploiting emotional data, so they can use it. It's difficult to scale emotion data, but of course they are very important for brand loyalty, for you know, drugstore or you know, distribution loyalty.
If I may take over and try to somehow give, I don't think it's an answer to your question, but I think basically what I perceive as important in the type of discussion we have had today, you know, on this interaction between data, competition, and these kind of issues, is that, and I think it was very visible from your presentation, and you know, the way in which Patrick modeled data was kind of abstract, and I guess, you know, this brings us, you know, to one level further, and you know, he did not really define the type of data that he was using, and indeed, as I mentioned in my introduction, Jacques Kremer and co-authors basically somehow tried to define data and relate, you know, the type of data to the type of outcome in terms of competition. I think that, you know, the type of data you used was a specific kind of data, and I think, you know, to go one step in the direction that you mentioned, basically, I think it will become important to understand what kind of data leads to what kind of competition. And I think that there, I take your point that, you know, presumably, and therefore there will be more research will be important. It will be important to understand whether the specificity of the data leads to another outcome in terms of competition. But this is somehow, I guess, the will be the subject, hopefully, of a next seminar. But definitely, it's a point we take into account. Were there other questions?
But are they involved? Brokers, are they involved in selling emotional data or not?
Well, I don't know. Can you please?
Oui, bonjour. Frederick Engel from Federation. I would like to just jump on the idea that data brokers are algorithm today already. Real-time bidding, for example, that we haven't really yet touched, even though we spoke about Facebook and other data, let's say, collectors or processors. A real-time bidding in the ad tech market is very much this kind of information exchange marketplaces where algorithms are already profiling the emotional or non-emotional data that has been collected and do form our digital footprint. So whether is, as a matter of fact, not, I think the issue whether it's emotional and unemotional, it has value, and that value drives not only advertising, whether it's contextual, behavioral, whatever, but next generation, intelligent, artificial, not services. What matters here, and I'm interested in understanding better why data brokers would be interested in leaving the EU, whereas GDPR has been designed to facilitate free flow of data and provide more than a digital single market, but the first data marketplace, which will be monetized, and probably GAFA will be, yes, indeed, the first to benefit from that single digital marketplace. So my question is very much in that competitive understanding that you are obviously assessing. How do you believe, let's put ourselves 1, 2, 3 years from now, how do we, or could we position ourselves with, let's say, a fulfilled provision GDPR vis-à-vis other large markets where AI, not advertising, not data profiling is the issue, but the service that is resulting from the data brokerage marketplace. How do we position ourselves, do you think, thanks to GDPR maybe, and other laws, e-privacy among others, vis-à-vis the US, vis-à-vis China, or vis-à-vis other markets? So looking forward, do you think that we have now a better chance, or equal, or no, it hasn't changed anything?
If you ask the question to me, unfortunately, I mean, it's difficult. But I think it's an important question. Hope someone has an answer.
Yes, so it's a question that we that's very important in the chair. It's actually one of the axes of the main axis of the research axis of the chair. It's a question about trust, and indeed, there is a direct indirect link between trust and competition. Why? How? It's not easy, but we have a research agenda on this. So directed a thesis on this problem, and what we found is that when people do not trust the intermediaries because of data issues, because they don't know how the company is handling their personal data, it starts to create situation of, if you're an economist, you know the expression information asymmetry, meaning that what the company knows more about what they do with the data than you do. And it creates a situation of distrust in the sense that if you're not sure what's happening to your data, then you have what we call a Lemon's problem, in reference to George Akerlof's paper on trust on secondary or second-hand markets. When you enter a second-hand market and you don't know the quality of, say, a car, well, you're not going to buy the car because you don't know if it's a good quality or bad quality. And you have exactly the same type of problem when you're giving data to a company and you don't know what the company is doing with that data. And what we show in that thesis is that when you don't trust the companies that are handling your personal data, it can lead to this type of exactly same type of situation. And I'm a witness to that. So I recently unsubscribed from Amazon because I was not trusting the company anymore with what they were doing with my data. I pulled out, I closed my Facebook account in 2008 when it was clear that they were tagging, allowing people to tag photos without consent. And in 2011, when Google started to merge all the services and the data from different services, I also stopped using the services. And why? Because I was not trusting these services anymore. And so trust is not, people say trust, that's a problem for sociologists and philosophers. It's not. It's actually at the core of the digital economy. If you don't trust the actors of the digital economy, you are going to end up like me, not doing nothing on the internet anymore. And that's not good for the economy. So if the data broker cannot gain your trust and not guarantee that they are handling your data in a way that's compliant with the regulation, that's not going to be good for the long term. So you are talking about the long term. And so that's why the situation with the GDPR might have a short-term negative effect, because then you have venture capitalists that leave the EU to go somewhere else. But in the long term, in my opinion, it's very important to have such regulation to guarantee that people trust the digital economy.
I guess we were supposed to hand back the micros about 15 minutes ago, but we have time for a last question.
Good evening. My name is Maurizio Vaccari. I'm a founder of a startup building a platform helping users to taking back control over their personal data. We talk a lot about data tonight and about data brokers and so on, but always, from what I understand, from a company point of view, And one important aspect of the GDPR is also data portability. So what changed for data brokers, and from a competition point of view, if there are no data brokers anymore selling data here and there, but are the users that are empowered to transfer the data from a website to another, for example, from a supermarket chain to another, and so on. So what's your point of view of data portability in this context?
We have no evidence so far on the effect of data portability. It's too new. It's a new principle that was that was brought by the GDPR. We have some. Then I will let Alexis talk because he's probably more experienced about this. There is such principle in the mobile phone industry when you can move your phone number to another company, but this is very different because we are talking about single number versus all the songs that you have listened in the last 15 years. That's a very different situation. The problem with the data portability, I think, is that it's supposed to enhance competition, and that's why probably it was there in the first place. I'm not sure because these were data protection lawyers writing this. So I'm not even sure that was the reason, but it's clear that an effect of this requirement would be to increase competition. But the problem is that there is no competition in these markets. All these markets are dominated by a single firm. And so I was reading an article about what you do when you leave Facebook, and the answer is you don't know what you do because there is no strong competitor to Facebook. So there were many posts about deleting your Facebook account, but in fact the number of subscribers to Facebook has still increased, even after the Cambridge Analytica scandal. And the reason is that these are dominant players, and there are strong network externalities, as we mentioned before. And it's not so easy to leave such a dominant platform to go to a smaller platform. And there might not even be such platform might not be available right now. So data portability, I think, is an interesting principle, but it's not going to resolve all the problems by itself because you have this problem of market dominance by dominant players.
So first of all, I think it's indeed good to have portability, but I would agree with Patrick that a number of things that Jacques Kremer and his co-authors, for instance, highlight is that if you have networks effects, and especially on these platforms, sometimes you have different groups. It's difficult to have the same matchings elsewhere. And so whatever the portability of my data, for instance, Patrick mentioned Facebook. So for instance, suppose I have liked something that makes me attractive, to a company who wants to target me as a user, customer, or whatever. Basically, if they know that they can find me on Facebook, wherever I can share my data with, which is not on Facebook, it's unclear that the same company will be able to target me in another way. Because basically, it's the match that often is useful. And therefore, what Kremer et al. Say is that basically you have a competition for the market, and it's important to be there first with these kind of very important network effects. But again, I think that, facilitating data portability for a number of other usages is extremely important. And so I guess that, if you can, for instance, people say that, the data, another example of Patrick's was about your quality as a lender. So, if you are able to get, say, a mortgage from a bank, if you are able to get the data you have accumulated with your bank to a competitor, it might be extremely useful. So basically, I think that, the correct answer, if there is a correct answer, depends very much on the type of sector, the type of platforms you are thinking of, and that there is no one-size-fits-all kind of answer, and that depending of the nature of competition, on the nature of the data, and the nature of the type of data you have, the answer might be different. So unfortunately, this is not an answer.
Okay, very brief extra comment. I agree with both of you, but then in addition, at least in certain platforms or in certain market areas, I would see it possible that it at least might give an incentive for those individuals or potential firms that are not yet in the market to develop some innovative ideas. If you get enough innovative idea to produce a new platform, I can't give you an example because I don't have such innovative ideas, but if you get better platform than Facebook, for instance, and then there's data portability, then you know that the barrier to enter market is much lower. If you enter the market and if you convince all these consumers, they can all take the data and come with you. So you can maybe replace one of these old monopoly players, at least in principle.